only mode.
Good afternoon. Just in the UK, just past 12 o'clock. I'm Kate Boothroyd. I'm the author of Mentor for Module 3, Risk Assessment, which I'm hoping you know because you should have hopefully joined us for the induction webinar. And I'm going to present today's mid-programme tutorial for this module. This webinar is expected to last for no more than an hour, probably less, depending on the questions, where I'm going to focus on particular topics in the module and consider it, or a particular topic, and I'm going to consider it from a number of different angles. Okay, so far we have 7 out of a hopeful 27 going to join us, so just while I check everything is working okay. Okay, good. Everything seems to be working. Okay then. If we move on very quickly. For those of you who don't know me, I thought I'd just give a little introduction about me. I am a certified fellow of the IRM. I was actually a fellow from 1996, certified for the last couple of years, as we've moved into the certification route. I'm not only the author and mentor of this module, but I'm also the co-author and accredited trainer for the new certificate blended learning courses. And I'm a trainer for the IRM through the FORM course, the Fundamentals of Risk Management, and the Project Risk Management course. I also present for the PMI, and I do some lecturing at Leeds Beckett University. And on top of that, I also still work within industry or different industries around the world. So hopefully some of that learning I can share with you as we go through this webinar. So as usual, I have been using some references that I just wanted to point out to you as we go through this webinar. Again, it's not that you need this with you now, it's just to let you know where I'm getting a lot of my information from. So this time I'll be referencing both the study guide and the reading materials quite heavily throughout the webinar. I want to do that to demonstrate how your learning must recognise the interrelatedness of the different parts of the risk management process. And this should help you also in the examinations, as the exam questions often cover different parts of the syllabus in a single question. And I'm going to give you an example of that later on in the webinar. So what is included in this webinar? Well, as it's a mid-programme tutorial, as I said, I'm going to focus on what I think you might find a key challenge in the study guide and in your learning. I'm going to try and put some real-life examples forward to help support the theory for you. And I factored in some time into the webinar for any questions you may have. Although I'll be speaking all of the time, you are muted, I'm afraid. So if you do want to ask any questions, please use the control panel. And in there are it's the ability for you to type in some questions. So if you put them in there, I will try and answer those questions as we go through the webinar. If we have any other questions at the end that aren't related to the webinar, that's absolutely fine. I'll try and pick up those if we have time. Otherwise, and if I can't answer these questions, or if you have any outside of the webinar, please post those onto the LinkedIn discussion forum, and we can sort those questions out as we go through. Then I'll summarise the session at the finish, just so we can wrap it all up. Just before we go any further, I just wanted to say that a lot of worries or problems that seem to occur around this module and answering the questions seems more to be, or as much to be, about the exam technique as much as the material itself. because the exams here are slightly different than the ones you'll have had, definitely different than the one you'll have had in the certificate module 1, which is all multiple choice questions. And they're similar to the end of the questions in part B for module 2. So the question types will be different. But I'm going to do a revision webinar on that nearer the revision time. So we'll spend a little bit more time on that later on in the revision webinar. As usual, this webinar has been recorded and you can listen to it again if you wish as soon as we get it posted onto the module webpage, usually within the day or so. So you should recognise these as the key learning outcomes from the study guide. And what I've done is I've looked back over previous exam papers and I've thought about how people have struggled different parts and thought about this from my practical knowledge of implementing risk management. And I've decided this time in this webinar to concentrate a little bit on Unit 3, which is around qualitative risk analysis. And if we look at Unit 3 itself, so these are the learning outcomes for Unit 3. And if you know from your study, remember from your study, that has 8 sections. What I'm really going to be thinking about in detail is the section 2, which is about objectivity in risk rating. So here, your learning outcome is explaining the need for objective rating scales. So before we go into any great detail, it's worthwhile thinking about some definitions. As much as anything else, because when you do your exams and you are dealing with your answers, one of the things that the examiner will always want is for you to define some of the key terms that you're going to be using in your exam answers. So it's worthwhile us thinking about some of the key terms in relation to objectivity. Now, the first one is actually going back to the definition of risk. And it's a reminder that risk is an effect of uncertainty on our objectives. But if we take it back to a simple format, which is exactly the same, just using slightly different words, we're talking about an uncertainty that matters. So if it's not uncertain, it's not a risk. If it doesn't matter to your objectives, then it's not a risk. Okay? It's just an uncertainty you know about. So that's the first definition. And I want that because it reminds us of some of the points I'm going to make throughout the webinar. Then we move on to the second definition here, and this is on risk analysis, because this is a module, Unit 3 in the module. And risk analysis is the process to comprehend the nature of risk and to determine the level of risk. And I've noted a couple of, I put down the notes in relation to this, and these are all definitions, by the way, as you can see from ISO 31000. And note 1 relates to risk analysis provides the basis for risk evaluation and decisions about risk treatment. So we need to be thinking about getting good quality information here, because people are going to use this information to make decisions. And then also it talks about risk analysis includes risk estimation. So it helps us think that estimation might be not just qualitative, but actually we might be thinking maybe of some quantitative analysis here. So this takes us through evaluation and treatment, so it's almost pushing us on to the next 2 steps and risk estimation. So the next set of definitions here are in relation to some of the notes we just had in the previous definitions, so they all relate to each other. When we're talking about the level of risk, this is the magnitude of a risk or combination of a risk expressed in terms of the combination of consequence and their likelihood. And consequence is the outcome of an event affecting objectives, and consequences can be expressed qualitatively or quantitatively. So again, we're thinking about how we use the information. And then likelihood is the chance of something happening. So all things that you should know about, things that we've included in definitions throughout the study guide. And then moving on, just to think a little bit more about likelihood, and I think it's useful here because it relates directly to our focus point for this webinar, which is objectivity. So we've said likelihood is the chance of something happening. In the notes under the definitions from the ISO are, in risk management terminology, the word likelihood is used to refer to the chance of something happening, whether defined, measured, or determined objectively or subjectively, qualitatively or quantitatively, and described using general terms or mathematically. So we can be using terms such as probability or frequency over a given period of time. So that's just reading out that note. And then in relation to objectivity also, we talk in note 2 about the English term likelihood doesn't have a direct equivalent in some languages. So instead, the equivalent of the term probability is often used. However, in English, probability is often narrowly interpreted as a mathematical term. So in risk management terminology, likelihood is used with the intent that it should have the same broad interpretation as the term probability has in many other languages other than English. So if we're having problems or struggling to define the term likelihood in English, it's understandable that people have trouble when providing a consensus or agreement over something that can be quite subjective and is therefore often influenced by our different perceptions. So, you know, if we can't think about defining the word likelihood, it's very difficult when we start to say how likely a risk is to occur. And then finally, just to think about some definitions, and these aren't from the ISO, I've just taken these from the internet. So I've got Cambridge English Dictionary and the Business Dictionary here. Objectivity is something that is being based on facts and influenced by, influenced by personal beliefs or feelings, where subjectivity is influenced by or based on personal feelings or beliefs rather than based on facts. So this is what we were talking about in terms of objectivity within the study guide. It's very difficult when you're dealing with something in the future that you don't know everything about, hence the uncertainty. It can be quite difficult to be objective. And then when we're talking about decision making, that's the thought process of selecting a logical choice from the available options. And when we're thinking about selecting the choice from the available options, it's difficult if we have made subjective judgments about those risks and those options. And there's just a slight note there to say that many of the definitions that I looked at online actually talk about decision making being done within a group of people rather than being done in isolation. So you can kind of say, so what? What does all of this mean? Well, if we're thinking about all those terms and decisions, we need to consider how we're going to make an objective decision when trying to analyse risk. So as risk is an uncertainty that matters, we usually look at the likelihood of the risk occurring, because that helps us measure the uncertainty, and the consequences should it occur, which can help us measure the impact. And we do this using a simple scale like this. So very simply, we consider whether we think a risk has a high or low likelihood or impact. But when we try to make decisions in a group or try to convey those judgments or our judgments to others, it is difficult to do so when we use such a simple scale. For example, I'm quite risk averse, and I'm prone to thinking that downside risks or threats are highly likely to occur, and when they do occur, and the word when there, not even if, when they do occur, it'll be a disaster. So a low to high scale doesn't really provide us with enough granularity or information to give a proper evaluation, because life isn't that easy. It's not just high or low. And also we need to understand what high or low means so we can have a useful conversation. So perhaps we could move on and provide a little bit more granularity by doing a 3-point scale. So we've got low, medium and high there. But again, it can be difficult to make sure that you have enough granularity, because sometimes the risk is high, but it's higher than the other high risk. So A 3x3 grid is fine, but we need to be careful with that sometimes. But when we look at that, it doesn't really make it obvious to us which are the biggest risks. So this is why you'll get something like the risk matrix and the colouring like this. So we have, quite often this is called a RAG matrix, a red, amber, green, or a RAG chart. So the red are the top priority, and then we move on down through the different priorities there. You'll remember something very similar to this in the Hopkins book on fundamentals of risk management, although there's a lot more granulation because the picture in the book has lots of little boxes in there, and he talks about having the 4 C's for threats there, which is critical, concerned, cautious, and comfort zones. However, different organisations have different kinds of risk matrices, but it's helpful for us to think about and use these because this gives us an idea when we rate our risks, where do those risks sit? Are they important or not? But if we wanted more granularity still, we could use the 5x5 grid. And here, rather than just using words such as high, medium, low, or very low to very high, we actually put some numbers against it to denote the range from low likelihood to high likelihood, and the same for impact. So we're putting some numbers against it, but it is still very subjective. Although if we knew quite a bit about the risk and hadn't got any preconceived ideas or perceptions, and we can be quite objective, we could use this quite well, but people do come with a lot of information, a lot of baggage, a lot of knowledge. But this is the risk matrix. This helps us think about which are the biggest risks that we need to deal with first. You may have noticed on here, by the way, that the colours on the matrix aren't symmetrical. So the red zone goes further down towards the impact than it does against the likelihood. And this is an indication that there's more weighting on the likelihood than on the impact. So if a risk is unlikely to occur but could destroy the business, managers will probably want to know about that. So here we are here, unlikely to occur, but if it does, it's going to destroy the business. Managers are going to be more likely to want to know about that than they would do where it's highly likely to occur but doesn't have a significant impact on the business. Because if we do a simple calculation and we said, well, a 1 likelihood times by a 5 impact, the answer to that, the combination of that, is a 5. And if we said we had a 5 likelihood and a 1 impact, the combination of that is also a 5. So by weighting the impact more than the likelihood, we can actually say that that's more important than that one. Hilton and Simon consider this a lot in their chapter 6 of the ATOM methodology book, and that's on page 74, where they talk about weighting. I don't know whether any of you come from the charity sector, but the charity sector, they also use weighting, and if that's the y-axis and this is the x-axis, they do y times by x plus x, so that gives the additional weighting. So there are different ways of doing that, but it helps you think about which is the most important, and quite often people will want to know a little bit more about the impact. And this also can reflect your risk tolerance. So some people have more red on their matrix than others. I've known some organisations actually have black up here, which says anything that fits in those boxes when they've rated their risks absolutely are the most important thing and have to be talked at high level. So it just depends on the organisation and the risk appetite. But as I said, that's still quite subjective, because what does 5 mean in likelihood? What does 5 mean in impact? So if I was just rating the risk there, I could be rating risks completely differently than somebody else. So we need to think about how we put objectivity into a very subjective subject. So this is quite a busy slide, but it's something that we is useful for us. So what do we mean by impact? And I'm looking at impact first, as I said before, because people or managers are quite keen to understand the impact on your objectives. Because if it doesn't have an impact at all, then there's no point in going any further, because it won't matter, it won't impact on the organisation. So having just a 1 to 5 rating, you can see the impact levels at the top there: insignificant up to major, or it could be very low to very high, or we have the numbers 1 to 5 there. So if we have a look at this, I'm risk averse, so I perceive a first aid case or up to 50 negative comments on reputation, or up to a $10,000 loss for a threat as a major risk. And I might be thinking of that and saying that in my mind, if we didn't have these scales in here, I'd be thinking about that and saying, well, these are all major, but somebody else could be having a completely different thought process around what these different levels against these different impact scales are. So we try to put this objectivity in by using these tangible measurements, so we can be quite clear what these scales mean. So we need to understand what insignificant means in terms of your objectives. Quite often objectives will be around finance, maybe around reputation. It could be safety, it could be production. It could be against the number of products that we've got production hours lost or saved, or the amount of output that you give out, in terms of whatever you produce within your organisation, whether it's reports or whether it's talking to people through call centres, or whether it's producing a widget or a gadget. So we need to think about what's important for you to achieve to be successful. So that's those objectives. Some people don't put tangible scales in here. They might use words such as we lose a little bit of money up to a lot of money, or we'd have a little bit of negative press up to a lot of negative press. So one of the ways of actually sending out a message around your risk appetite is to actually think about what does high and low mean to the organisation. I've worked with an organisation recently where their high impact on EBIT, which is earnings before interest and tax, was anything over £1 billion, which is something that a lot of you will probably be a little shocked at, but that's at corporate level, that's what they consider to be a very high impact in terms of EBIT. Their insignificant impact at corporate level was anything under £100 million. Whereas I've also been working recently with a local council, and their insignificant is anything that's over, I think it's £3,000 as at insignificant level, and then at the major level it's anything over £1 million, and that's at corporate level. So we need to think about what those scales are. And you can use historical data to help you build up these scales, to think about, you know, the problems that other organisations have had or you've had before, something that's caused a lot of pain for the organisation, and what you can actually cope with. But also you could use some of your key performance indicators. So if you have key performance indicators, they're there to measure your performance against your objectives. So if you have those, you could use the main one against a particular objective to help you fill in your rating scales here for impact. But don't get too confused here. We are putting quantities to these rating scales, but we're not using them to do quantitative analysis. We're just giving ourselves an idea of what we mean by insignificant, minor, moderate, high, or major, so that when we're trying to rate the risks, usually in teams, we have consistency and we all understand where each other are coming from. And as I said, we're considering what our objectives are and what's important to the success of whatever we're doing. So in this case, we have 4 different lenses in terms of impact. So we have safety, financial, production, reputation. As I said before, there could be others. Most organisations have anything between a 3 and 8. Some of them are around engaged clients or engaged customers, and it all depends on what their objectives are. One organisation I've worked with actually had 16 different impact scales. It really depends on your level of control or choice or the number of objectives that you have that need to be achieved. So we need to have a think about the objectives, but you need to try and be as tangible as possible to try and get some of that ambiguity out and lack of understanding. Then we have to do the same for likelihood. Again, as I said, being risk averse means that almost certain means anything up to a 5% chance of happening for me. So just using descriptive words again, such as rare up to almost certain, are useful, but you need to have the metrics behind it. I might not like the word rare, but now I understand how the team are scoring a risk with that likelihood. So anything under 5% or a 1 in 100-year chance over or once every 10 years, or a 1 in 100 chance, then at least we're on the same page and we have some consistency. So as you can see here, you can assess likelihood using probability, and that relates back to the definition that we had earlier. We could also use frequency. Probability is usually used for a risk that has 1 chance of happening in the time period you're considering. And frequency is often used where a risk can have more than 1 chance of happening in a time period. So once every 24 hours or once a week, if you've got that over a year-long period, that could be quite often that risk happens at the likely level. That could be 52 times in the year-long period. So that's frequency. Frequency metrics are also often used when talking to different people in different contexts. By that I mean, for example, in medicine or when we're talking about the weather, when we often hear things like you have a 1 in 12 chance of having whatever condition that you have, or there's a 1 in 100-year chance of there being flooding in a particular area. But it all depends on how and who you're communicating risk information to. The trouble is with any of this, this area is widely and wildly open to interpretation. There's actually a book by somebody called Gerd Gigerenzer called Calculated Risk, where he explains how the use of how to use risk assessment accurately. By the way, that book is not part of your essential reading, that's just an aside. But how people don't actually understand percentages and probabilities very well. So you need to think about how who your audience is and how they're going to relate to these things. So this is all going just to show that it can be difficult to be objective when we're making decisions about scoring risks in sometimes quite emotive and sometimes important situations. Qualitatively, though, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to find out which are the biggest risks, both threats and opportunities, that we need to deal with first. So we should use fairly quick and simple methods to do that. What we can do qualitatively is to provide as much tangible and unambiguous guidance as possible. So actually putting these ratings in so that people understand what you mean by those descriptive terms of insignificant up to major or rare up to almost certain. And then we can put these ratings together to start to build up the risk matrix that we looked at earlier. As you can see here, we've built that up. We've got the likelihood and the impact in there, and then we can put the colouring systems in. So once the matrix and the rating scales have been agreed, then we can start to score our risks. So we need to understand these and we need to develop those. Otherwise, we're going to be very subjective. Just a quick note here, another way to inject a little bit more objectivity, and something I've alluded to in other slides earlier and discussions we've had, is to actually try to score in a group. This is often done in most organisations, and actually I usually rate risks in the same session as risks have been identified, because you have all the key people there together anyway, whether that's face-to-face or virtually. If you don't do that, then you would probably have to have maybe a separate rating meeting, or you can send out the scores that decided by the risk owner, and perhaps get some experts to review that. Just a personal point of view here, that ratings in isolation, even if it's done by an expert, still relies on that one person or that one expert to apply objectivity. In groups, you can gain more information on the risk, and you can garner some opinion and comments that can help reduce, if not remove, some of that objectivity. So we can get an understanding of why people are making judgments about the size of risks. I recognise that it can't happen all of the time, but it is worthwhile considering that. Before we go any further, I just wanted to know whether anybody has any questions on anything we've been talking about. So far we've had to think about some of the definitions. Just to point out, by the way, unlike some of the questions in the certificate modules 1 and 2, when we give definitions in later modules, you're expected to get the general understanding of the definitions, but you're not expected to get the absolute perfect definition back again, or to say where you've got that from even sometimes. So but having an understanding of some of those key terms is very valuable to you, because that's where you can score and gain some easy marks. And again, I'll pick that up in the revision module webinar. So no questions so far, so I'm gathering everybody is quite happy with that. What we've looked at the moment is all threat, although we do show here in some of these definitions of impact, we could be looking at money made or lost, production hours saved or lost, and positive and negative comments. So we can take that and think about it in terms of both the upside, the opportunity, and the downside, the threat. But it's sometimes difficult to show those opportunities on a red, amber, green chart, because red is usually stop. So what can we do if we want to have opportunities? And you should have seen this from the studies so far. We can maybe think about having this butterfly matrix. The butterfly matrix is this is very similar to the one taken from Hopkin, so you should already be aware of that. It's just showing a 3 by 3 simple scale, but you can still do it by 5 by 5, or even more than that. I do have worked with organisations where they have 7 different impact scales on here. So they go from 1 to 7. They have 16 different impact types and 1 to 7 different impact scales there. Other examples that you will have seen in Hilson and Simon is that you could be using perhaps what we call the mirror matrix, where we're taking the opportunity on one side, the positive, and we're putting the negative on the other side, and then they're flipped over, so you get what they call the arrow of attention in here. Hilson and Simon suggest you're still using red, amber, green, but you could make yours red, amber, green for threats, and then have on the opportunity side, perhaps you could use different colours like the bronze, silver, gold, or maybe different shades of blue is something that I've seen quite often as well. But the point is, what you can do now is you can actually score your risks and plot them onto a risk register, onto your risk matrix. So this gives us an idea of the overall scoring of your risks, your overall, what I call your overall risk profile. So this is once you've scored your risks, you plot those risks onto the risk matrix, and this should give you a view of the biggest risk that you need to deal with first, so you can better consider your responses to those risks and focus your attention in the right place. Okay, all very simple so far, and I've just tried to think about how you can reduce some of the subjectivity in there. But when we're talking about analysis, and we're talking about likelihood, and we're talking about consequence, we did mention having both qualitative and quantitative analysis. So far, we've only really considered qualitative analysis of risk. but sometimes, as it said in the study guide, that's not enough. Although it's much easier to qualitatively assess risk, we might have to go a bit further. And when you start to consider hard numbers, maybe for profit or cost or time or resourcing, rather than just the qualitative ranges that we give in qualitative risk analysis, it can be more difficult when we try to put it into quantitative risk analysis. It can be difficult to be objective. So I've got a couple of other definitions here for you. The first is taken from the Project Management Institute, the PMI. The second is from Hilson and Simon. So qualitative risk analysis is thought of as the process of prioritizing the individual risks, and I've got in brackets project because that's the PMI, for further analysis or action by assessing their probability and their impact. Okay, which is what we've just been doing. Quantitative risk analysis, on the other hand, is the numerical analysis of risk exposure based on the probability and the impact of the identified risks, which predicts possible outcomes. So we're starting to put real tangible measures here onto the risks that need to be quantified. Okay, just some thoughts about the benefits and why we bother doing quantitative analysis. Well, in Garlick's book, he provides some benefits that are also in the study guide in Unit 4, but there are others available to you. Hilson and Simon provide some benefits to quantitative analysis, which are, although project-focused or related, are equally relevant to other business situations. But we're talking about combining the effects of risks, predicting future performance against key objectives, using unambiguous numbers, so we're getting really down into the detail here. Exposing key drivers, so we can actually see which the risks have the greatest influence over the outcomes. And we're giving some numerical answers. We're saying that something will cost a certain amount, or there's a range of costs or a range of times that we'll either lose or will gain. You'll find those benefits, by the way, from Hilson and Simon in chapter 15 of their book, but also Fraser and Simpkin considers the use of quantification in their introduction to chapter 13. Just some quick pitfalls of quantitative analysis. These are taken from Garlick, page 6. But that some of the problems or pitfalls with quantitative analysis are often related to subjectivity. So we have things like there's a systematic underestimation of cost and time to carry out an activity. And that will be based on maybe historical facts, but also it's often around people's perceptions of the size and the likelihood of risk. There's also a systematic underestimation of the management resources and managerial talent to actually achieve their objectives. And that's definitely subjective. And then there's the essential unpredictability of the future environment. Our ability to predict the future can be thrown off completely, sometimes by perceptions, subjectivity, sometimes by lack of knowledge. And I could go on and on, but there's quite a few things to think about here. So just some thoughts around objectivity and quantitative analysis before we leave this subject. It might be worthwhile asking for support on the different types of quantitative analysis that will be helpful in informing your decisions. Some people try to do Monte Carlo simulation where it's not useful. Some people just try to do simple net present value, simple flowcharts or decision trees that sometimes don't have enough information. As I said before, some of the techniques are too simple and some are far too complicated. To try and reduce some of the subjectivity when you're trying to put costs down on risks is to have well-worded risks so that you're quite clear on the causes and consequences, and that can remove some of that subjectivity. Gain expert support and knowledge in the area of the risk being measured. If you do that, that's really important. So don't just have a guess. Try and get as much information as you can. And then if you're going to do quantitative analysis, make sure you make notes to explain how you've decided on the quantities that you're going to use to measure those risks. Make notes not only so you remember what you did, but also this helps you to explain decisions to others when you're trying to gain buy-in or to counter any challenge that you'll have against those quantities. Okay, Michelle, thank you. So what level of knowledge of quantitative analysis will be required for the exam? To be quite honest, I don't know because I don't set the exams. However, if you have a look back at the past papers, the quantitative analysis isn't detailed. The actual study guide on this talks about basic modelling and basic understanding of different techniques. So there won't be any real need, I shouldn't think, to take in a calculator. You're not going to be asked to do this. And some of the quantitative analysis requires a computer program. So really, if I think back to some of the quantitative questions, they are talking about looking at the outputs. So what does an S-curve tell you? What does a density graph tell you? How can you use decision trees to help you make a decision? So they're more descriptive, more essay style answers around those. So don't panic too much. I know quantitative makes some people go into a flat spin, but we're not going through it in that kind of detail for this module. I hope that helps. Yeah, and I understand. Thank you again, Michelle. You don't have much exposure to this subject, so it's an area you need to focus on, and that's fine. But don't panic about it because you won't be doing any quantitative analysis. It's really understanding what needs to go in and what needs to come out. And there have been questions before about the problems with quantitative analysis. I do recognise also, though, that a lot of people do that because if you're in the financial services, you might have to do more quantitative. I think it's useful, actually, if you go back and have a look at the previous exam papers to see the style of quantitative questions. It won't give you the actual questions that you're going to be asked again because they don't repeat all the time or are used constantly, but it gives you the actual style. Yeah, good. Okay, so moving out of qualitative and quantitative, one of the things about objectivity really is people. You know, we've talked about a lot of metrics to try and reduce subjectivity, but it's worth a quick mention on how some of this subjectivity arises. And really, it's us, it's people. Hilson and Simon talk about this when rating risks qualitatively in chapter 6. I think that's around pages 71 to 75. By the way, I'm giving you all these page numbers. This is from the printed book, but chapter 6 should help you even if you have the electronic copy. And there are lots of different books available on the influence that people can have on the risk management process and its influence on them, and there are even risk personality profiling tools now available. So there's a lot going on about people. A lot of that will come from the fact that you can have as many processes as you like, but it comes down to people actually implementing those. If we think back to the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of that came from culture and people's attitudes and behaviours. So just drawing on a small part of that data that's available, the main areas in the study material are around risk perceptions and something that's called heuristics. So heuristics are subconscious factors or subconscious bias that affects your perception of risks. And it's defined as an approach to inferring a solution to a problem by reasoning from previous experience when no data set exists. So you're just going back to what you've seen before and making judgments from that without taking into account anything else. The four most common heuristics are provided here, and these are the ones that are talked about in the Hilson and Simon book. So the first one is availability. So you think back to the most or a more memorable event, and you give more significance to it than it perhaps deserves. And that is usually something that hasn't been very good. You might be thinking about the availability of it because it is quite recent, something that's happened recently, or it may be because it had a massive impact. And you need to check those judgments and make sure it's reasonable. The second one is representativeness, and this is where you use similarity to stereotype as an indicator of how significant a risk is. So if you think about, I don't know, people in the UK, we could say we're quite repressed about giving our opinion or talking plainly, but that's generic, and that generic thought process or that generic understanding might not work in the specific situations. If I showed you a picture of this, it's about putting a hexagon into a square peg, a square hole, because it kind of fits. So you just need to be careful that sometimes what you've seen before isn't actually being put into the right box, if that makes sense. The next one is called anchoring and adjustment, and this is where you start from an initial estimate and you vary around it, rather than thinking about whether or not the initial value actually is right. So, you know, somebody gives you a ballpark figure and then you stick with it, whether it's everything else has changed about how that ballpark figure was decided upon. So, you know, check whether or not that initial figure was the right figure in the first place. And then finally, there's something called confirmation trap, where you seek and weigh evidence which substantiates a prior conviction or a prior idea, ignoring anything that's contrary to that data. So you're assuming an answer, then you're looking for evidence to support or refute that assumption. Somebody gave me an example of people who do crime scene investigation, whereas in the past they may have been asked to find somebody guilty. Now they're asked to find the person innocent, because if they can't find anything to prove they're innocent, then they could probably be guilty. So more cases go through to court rather than being thrown out. So what you do is you end up having this kind of barrier that stops you seeing what you don't want to look at. So it's about opening up your eyes and seeing what else is available to you. So you can see that you need to be careful when considering risk analysis, because we have a massive influence on that. I'm not asking you to think about every different aspect of a person's attitude or perceptions, but you need to have an awareness of what might be there before you make a judgment. So how much information do you need in order to make a valid judgment and a less subjective judgment? So why have I been going on about all of this? You're probably thinking it's very interesting. I just wanted to show you some of the examples, exam questions that have come up around this subject before. So in November 2015, there was one about discussing how the risk manager can minimise bias and bring objectivity to the risk assessment process. In June 2016, it asks to discuss how risk professionals can minimise bias and bring objectivity to the risk assessment process. Begin your answer by identifying and defining the key concepts relating to objectivity and to risk assessment, which is one of the reasons why I talked about definitions in there. In June 2015, they talked about psychology and behavioural science has identified and categorised many influences on how we perceive risk. Discuss these influences and their significance for the effective assessment and management of risk. So this is one of the reasons why I've been going through this area of objectivity, because it does touch many different parts of the exam questions that you could be asked, but it touches many different parts of the module. So you can see that this topic in this guise or in other similar kinds of questions, so it's also been used, just doing a quick review, in November 2016, June 2017, June 2018. And the reason why it's asked so often is because people have a massive influence on the risk assessment or the assessment of risks. And assessment could be identification, analysis, or evaluation, but we've concentrated more here on analysis. Okay, so we need to think about how our thought process, our perceptions, our attitudes can influence the way that we say which are the biggest risks and then focus our attention on which ones need to be managed. I've just pinched this from one of the examiner's reports, just a few notes, which shows you why I've included a lot of this into the webinar today. So exact wording is not required, and students will be expected to demonstrate understanding by putting definitions for key terms into their own words. There you go, such as objectivity, risk assessment, decision making, and you could include any of those. So whatever you see in the question, you should then pull that apart and see whether you can give a definition of that, because that can gain you marks. Good answers to address selective points from the list below, so contrasting qualitative and quantitative. Discuss reliance on historical data as opposed to personal experience. So making sure you bring both of those together. Recognizing issues with risk perception and perception process. Considering cognitive bias, including the use of heuristics, the propensity to under and overestimate. So that one came out of the quantitative pitfalls. How personality may impact on judgmental processes. Contrast intuitive and judgmental or subjective decision making with rational economic decision making. So the more information you have, the better. Decompose risk assessment into different steps, focusing discussion on sub-processes. So, talking about analysis, bringing that out, talking about evaluation using the risk matrices. Discuss risk rating using word scales such as high, medium, and low, and contrast those with continuous scales. So you've got more tangible figures in there, more understanding, less ambiguity. Discussing the benefits of a group approach over expert individual assessments. And we mentioned that about if we leave it to the individual, even if they're an expert, we don't know what perceptions they have, which may skew some of their answers. And then discuss objectivity in both probability and impact judgments. Again, this just picks up earlier, having tangible information. So if we think back to what you have and how this all links together, going back to the beginning, we talked about objectivity. That's in section 3.2. There's the detailed section in that unit. But actually, we do look at different areas. So we talked about likelihood, and that's in section 3.3. Impact is in section 3.2, when we're talking about it qualitatively. Moving from qualitative to quantitative is in section 4.1. When we're thinking about quantitative assessment, and that's analysis, that's in section 4.3. We also talk about probability and impact from a quantitative point of view in sections 4.5 and 4.6. The reason I picked up what information do we share in section 5.6 is the output. So when we're trying to talk about S-curves or risk matrices or density graphs. We also touched a little bit on the risk-based decision makers. So how do we make decisions? And then also in section 6.4, we talk about making decisions in relation to risk. So they're all linked. So we've looked at different parts of the study guide within one area of potential exam questions. We've used the information outside of the detailed references that I've given you in the study guide. And we've also gone back to look at a little bit of learning you've undertaken from previous modules. So remember, we looked at the risk matrix and I talked about the 4 C's from Hopkin. As I stated in the induction webinar, Phil Kelly says that in his introductory video for this module, modules 3 and 4 have taken the study of risk management further than the certificate, and that these modules are taking you into the practice of the risk manager. So we've seen these different points from those exam questions over the last couple of years, and I just wanted you to recognise, or better recognise, how risk learning can't be kept in isolation. And that's not just from an exam point of view, but it's also from your real life perspective. So if you're asked questions, don't think in a silo base of where it might fit. So although objectivity is in section 3, and most of the time the questions around objectivity are the third question on the exam, you can see that we're bringing in all sorts of different areas, and we will go through that a little more in the we will go through that in the revision webinar as well. So, sorry, somebody's just asked, are there other webinars? That's what put me off here, apart from the revision one. No, you have the induction, which has already been recorded. If you haven't seen that, you can go and look at that online. It's online now for you. There's this one, which is being recorded and will be put back online as well. And then we have the revision webinar. If you have any questions on any of this, there is the LinkedIn discussion forum for you. I don't look at it every day, and it should send me notifications of questions. So if I haven't answered anything on there, I haven't had a notification, so I need to go back and have a look at that. Oh yeah, I think I was just trying to say also, yeah, just a reminder that it's not just examination, but it's also something we should be thinking about, how these work across that in real life. Okay, I just have a couple of minutes left after all of this. If anybody has any other questions for me, but if you don't now, don't forget you can ask me questions and post those on the LinkedIn discussion forum, as I said before. You should all know where that is now. It's at the bottom of your module 3 page on the study in the in the study section of the IRM web pages. Sorry, if you go on there at the bottom, there is a maroon box. I think it's maroon now, and you'll find the discussion forum, and you can go into LinkedIn on there. Okay, all quiet. So I will move on to the last slide. So just a few points to tell you what we've talked about, really. Don't stay in silos of learning. I've said that before. Consider how information is linked. Use the learning activities. They are in there to help you think about those real life examples, but they will help you embed your learning. Look at the past exam questions. You will see this one was asked in the June exams this year, so this kind of question might not be asked next time, but it might be. But apart from anything else, it's really important for you as practitioners of risk management to understand how objectivity and subjectivity is very important. And don't forget the basics when you're thinking about learning. But in particular, by that I mean you need to think about learning key definitions. You will need them for the exams. As I said before, the exams in this module are essay style, and the examiner will expect to see the key definitions and the terms explained, because you need to consider that you're writing an essay, basically, for someone who doesn't know much about risk management. The examiners do know a lot about risk management, by the way, but you need to think and write your essays in the terms of they don't. So you're making sure that you fully understand, and they know that you fully understand the subject. As I said before, these definitions don't need to be exactly the same as those given in the books or standards, but should be accurate nonetheless. And look back at the examiner's reports. So it's not just the past papers, but look at the reports around the past papers. All of that should help you and guide you with your studies. I hope this webinar has been helpful to you to think about a particular area. But don't forget that this webinar will be available on the Module 3 pages for replay later if you want to listen to this again. Again, I hope it's been useful to you, and good luck. And I will speak to you through a webinar later on in the revision one. Thank you.